welcome back to Storytime. So today we are starting The Heroic Slave by Frederick Douglass, which is his one novel that he's written. He's most well known for his nonfiction work and his orations and speeches and the like. And as I was putting up my tweet to let people know when Storytime would be starting, I came across the hashtag Douglass Week. And so I looked it up, and apparently starting tomorrow is Douglass Week, which they are celebrating in Ireland, celebrating the week that he spent in Ireland in 1845. I also found out, actually it would have been perfect if I had started this next Sunday, because his assumed birthday, they couldn't really pinpoint the exact date, was February 14th, and then he passed away on February 20th when he was 77 years old. So it is very much, February is definitely Frederick Douglass's month, I'm coming to find out. Anyways, I was totally excited when I found this because I didn't know that he had written any. Oh, hello. Hi, Corral. Good to see you. I didn't know that he had written any fiction, so when I was going through the Dover classics and saw that, I jumped on the chance, definitely. There is another book that I would like to read this month. There is I can check out the digital edition of the book. I was hoping to have the physical copy of it. And it is called The Quest for the Silver Fleece by W.E.B. Du Bois. And it sounds really interesting. Let's see. Okay. So I'm not going to read the whole note beforehand because the note technically is not public domain, but it really is interesting that apparently his only work of fiction, which is The Heroic Slave, is based on a real event. I won't spoil it, so I won't tell you what the real event is, but I am interested to see what this is about. But I'm going to chat a little bit before we get started. How was your weekend, Corel? Here too, yeah. I hope you've been getting sleep in. I've stupidly only been getting 5.5 hours of sleep, and I'm definitely feeling it. And this month is turning out to be a lot busier than I had previously been expecting. But I'm definitely going to keep my 3 streams a week schedule. I may have to take one of them off for eye doctor appointment whenever I can schedule that. We'll see. We just hired 3 new people at work, so hopefully that will help. All right. Well, I think I am going to go ahead and get started. Okay. Oh, yeah, same here. I don't think I got a wink of dreamless sleep last night. They were very active, very bizarre dreams, too. And I can still definitely remember very vividly some of the snippets of the dreams. I'm sorry to hear that you go through the weird, messed up dreams as well. Let me find, there's our little singing maestro, so we're gonna make him disappear and start. Part 1. O child of grief, why weepest thou? Why droops thy sad and mournful brow? Why is thy look so like despair? What deep sad sorrow lingers there? The state of Virginia is famous in American annals for the multitudinous array of their statesmen and heroes. She has been dignified by some the mother of statesmen. History has not been sparing in recording the names or in blazoning their deeds. Her high position in this respect has given her an enviable distinction among her sister states. With Virginia for his birthplace, even a man of ordinary parts, on account of the general partiality for her sons, easily rises to eminent stations. Men not great enough to attract special attention in their native states have, like a certain distinguished citizen in the state of New York, sighed and repined that they were not born in Virginia. Yet not all the great ones of the Old Dominion have, by the fact of their birthplace, escaped undeserved obscurity. By some strange neglect, one of the truest, manliest, and bravest of her children, one who, in after years, will, I think, command the pen of genius to set his merits forth, holds now no higher place in the records of that grand old commonwealth than is held by a horse or an ox. Let those account for it who can, but there stands the fact that a man who loved liberty as well as did Patrick Henry, who deserved it as much as Thomas Jefferson, and who fought for it with a valor as high and strong, and an arm as strong and against odds as great as he who led all the armies of the American colonies through the great war of freedom and independence, lives now only in the chattel records of his native state. Glimpses of this great character are all that can now be presented. He is brought to view only by a few transient incidents, and these afford but partial satisfaction. Like a guiding star on a stormy night, he is seen through the parted clouds and the howling tempests, or like the gray peak of a menacing rock on a perilous coast, he is seen by the quivering flash of angry lightning, and he again disappears covered with mystery. Curiously, earnestly, anxiously, we peer into the dark, and wish even for the blinding flash, for the light of northern skies to reveal him. But alas, he is still enveloped in darkness, and we return from the pursuit like a wearied and disheartened mother after a tedious and unsuccessful search for a lost child, who returns weighted down with disappointment and sorrow. Speaking of marks, traces, possibles, and probabilities, we come before our readers. In the spring of 1835, on a Sabbath morning, within hearing of the solemn peals of the church bells at a distant village, a northern traveler through the state of Virginia drew up his horse to drink at the sparkling brook near the edge of a dark pine forest. While his weary and thirsty steed drew in the grateful water, the rider caught the sound of a human voice, apparently engaged in earnest conversation. Following the direction of the sound, he descried among the tall pines the man whose voice had arrested his attention. To whom can he be speaking? Thought the traveler. He seems to be alone. The circumstances interested him much, and he became intensely curious to know what thoughts and feelings, or it might be high aspirations, guided those rich and mellow accents. Tying his horse to a short distance from the brook, he stealthily drew near the solitary speaker, and, concealing himself by the side of a huge fallen tree, he distinctly heard the following soliloquy. What then is life to me? It is aimless and worthless, and worse than worthless. Those birds perched on yon swinging boughs, in friendly conclave, sounding forth their merry notes in seeming worship of the rising sun, though liable to the sportsman's fowling piece, are still my superiors. They live free, though they may die slaves. They fly where they list by day, and retire in freedom at night. But what is freedom to me, or I to it? I am a slave, born a slave, an abject slave. Even before I made part of this breathing world, the scourge was plaited for my back. The fetters were forged for my limbs. How mean a thing am I, that accursed and crawling snake, that miserable reptile, was just glided into its slimy home. It's freer and better off than I. He escaped my blow and is safe. And here am I, a man, yes, a man, with thoughts and wishes, with powers and faculties as far as an angel's flight above that hated reptile. Yet he is my superior and scorns its own me, and scorns to own me as his master or to stop to take my blows. When he saw my uplifted arm, he darted beyond my reach and turned to give me battle. I dared not do as much as that. I neither run nor fight, but do meanly stand answering each heavy blow of a cruel master with doleful wails and piteous cries. I am galled with irons, but even these are more tolerable than the consciousness, the galling consciousness of cowardice and indecision. Can it be that I dare not run away? Perish the thought. I dare do anything which may be done by another. And that young man struggled with the waves for life. Another stood back appalled in helpless horror. Did I not plunge in, forgetful of life, to save his? The raging bull from whom all others fled, pale with fright, did I not keep at bay with a single pitchfork? Could a coward do that? No, I wrong myself. I am no coward. Liberty I will have, or die in the attempt to gain it. This working that others may live in idleness. This cringing submission to insolence and curses. This living under the constant dread and apprehension of being sold and transferred like a mere brute is too much for me. I will stand it no longer. What others have done, I will do. These trusty legs, those sinewy arms, shall place me among the free. Tom escaped, so can I. The North Star will not be less kind to me than to him. I will follow it. I will at least make the trial. I have nothing to lose. If I am caught, I shall only be a slave. If I am shot, I shall only lose a life which is a burden and a curse. If I get clear, something tells me I shall, liberty, the inalienable birthright of every man, precious and priceless, will be mine. My resolution is fixed. I shall be free. At these words, the traveler raised his head cautiously and noiselessly, and caught from his hiding place a full view of the unsuspecting speaker. Madison, for that was the name of our hero, was standing erect. A smile of satisfaction rippled upon his expressive countenance, like that which plays upon the face of one who has but just solved a difficult problem, or vanquished a malignant foe. For at that moment he was free, at least in spirit. The future gleamed brightly before him, and his fetters lay broken at his feet. His air was triumphant. Madison was of manly form, tall, symmetrical, round, and strong. In his movements he seemed to combine with the strength of the lion, a lion's elasticity. His torn sleeves disclosed arms like polished iron. His face was black but comely. His eye, lit with emotion, kept guard under a brow as dark and as glossy as the raven's wing. His whole appearance betokened Herculean strength, yet there was nothing savage or forbidden in his aspect. A child might play in his arms or dance on his shoulders. A giant's strength, but not a giant's heart, was in him. His broad mouth and nose spoke only of good nature and kindness, but his voice, that unfailing index of the soul, though full and melodious, had that in it which could terrify as well as charm. He was just the man you would choose when hardships were to be endured, or danger to be encountered, intelligent and brave. He had the head to conceive, and the hand to execute. In a word, he was one to be sought as a friend, but to be dreaded as an enemy. As our traveler gazed upon him, he almost trembled at the thought of this dangerous intrusion. Still, he could not quit the place. He had long desired to sound the mysterious depths of the thoughts and feelings of a slave. He was not, therefore, disposed to allow so providential an opportunity to pass unimproved. He resolved to hear more, so he listened again for those mellow and mournful accents which, he says, made such an impression upon him as can never be erased. He did not have to wait long. There came another gush from the same full fountain, now bitter and now sweet. Scathing denunciations of the cruelty and injustice of slavery, heart-touching narrations of his own personal suffering, intermingled with prayers to the God of the oppressed for help and deliverance, were followed by presentations of the dangers and difficulty of escape, and formed the burden of his eloquent utterances. But as his high resolution clung to him, for he ended each speech by an emphatic declaration of his purpose to be free. It seemed that the very repetition of this imparted a glow to his countenance. The hope of freedom seemed to sweeten, for a season, the bitter cup of slavery, and to make it, for a time, intolerable. For when in the very whirlwind of anguish, when his heart's cord seemed screwed up to snapping tension, hope sprung up and soothed his troubled spirit. Fitfully he would exclaim, "How can I leave her? Poor thing, what can she do when I am gone? Oh, 'tis impossible that I can leave poor Susan." A brief pause intervened. Our traveler raised his head and saw again the sorrow-smitten slave. His eye was fixed upon the ground. The strong man staggered under a heavy load. Recovering himself, he argued thus aloud. "All is uncertain here. Tomorrow's sun may not rise before I am sold and separated from her that I love. What then could I do for her? I should be in more hopeless slavery, and she no nearer to liberty. Whereas if I were free, my arms and my own, I might devise the means to rescue her." This said, Madison cast down the searching glance as if the thought of being overheard had flashed across his mind. He said no more, but with measured steps walked away and was lost to the eye of our traveler amidst the wildering woods. Long after Madison had left the ground, Mr. Listwell, our traveler, remained in motionless silence, meditating on the extraordinary revelations to which he had listened. He seemed fastened to the spot, and stood half hoping, half fearing the return of the sable preacher to his solitary temple. The speech of Madison rung through the chambers of his soul and vibrated through his entire frame. Here is indeed a man, thought he, of rare endowments, a child of God, guilty of no crime but the color of his skin, hiding away from the face of humanity and pouring out his thoughts and feelings, his hopes and resolutions to the lonely woods. To him those distant church bells have no grateful music. He shuns the church, the altar, and the great congregation of Christian worshippers, and wanders away to the gloomy forest to utter in the vacant air complaints and griefs, which the religion of his times and his country can neither console nor relieve. Goaded almost to madness by the sense of the injustice done him, he resorts hither to give vent to his pent-up feelings, and to debate with himself the feasibility of plans of his own invention for his own deliverance. From this hour I am an abolitionist. I have seen enough and heard enough, and I shall go to my home in Ohio, resolved to atone for my past indifferences to this ill-starred race, by making such exertions as I shall be able to do for the speedy emancipation of every slave in the land. Part 2. The gaudy, babbling, and remorseful days crept into the bosom of the sea, and now loud howling wolves aroused the jades that dragged the tragic, melancholy night, who with their drowsy, slow, and flagging wings clip dead men's graves, and from their misty jaws breathe foul contagions, darkness in the air. A quote from William Shakespeare. 5 years after the foregoing singular occurrence in the winter of 1840, Mr. and Mrs. Listwell sat together by the fireside of their happy home in the state of of their own happy home in the state of Ohio. The children were all gone to bed. A single lamp burnt brightly on the center table. All was tall and comfortable within, but the night was cold and dark. A heavy wind sighed and moaned sorrowfully around the house and barn, occasionally bringing against the chattering windows a stray leaf from which the large oak trees that embowered their dwelling. It was a night for strange noises and for strange fancies. A whole wilderness of thought might pass through one's mind, and during such an evening, the smoldering embers, partaking of the spirit of the restless night, became fruitful of varied and fantastic pictures, and revived many bygone scenes and old impressions. The happy pair seemed to sit in silent fascination, gazing at the fire. Suddenly, this reverie was interrupted by a heavy growl. Ordinary such as an occurrence would have scarcely provoked a single word or excited the least apprehension. But there are certain seasons when the slightest sound sends a jar through all the subtle chambers of the mind, and such a season was this. The happy pair started up, as if some sudden danger had come upon them. The growl was from their trusty watchdog. "What can it mean? Certainly no one can be out on such a night as this," said Mrs. Listwell. "The wind has deceived the dog, my dear. He's mistaken the noise of falling branches brought down by the wind for that of the footsteps of persons coming to the house. I've several times tonight thought that I heard the sound of footsteps. I'm sure, however, that it was but the wind. Friends would not be likely to come out at such an hour or such a night, and thieves are too lazy and self-indulgent to expose themselves to this biting frost. But should there be any one about, our brave old Monty, who is on the lookout, will not be slow in sounding the alarm." Saying this, they quietly left the window, whither they had gone to learn the cause of the menacing growl, and reseated themselves by the fire, as if reluctant to leave the slowly expiring embers, although the hour was late. A few minutes only intervened after resuming their seats, when again their sober meditations were disturbed. Their faithful dog now growled and barked furiously, as if assailed by an advancing foe. Simultaneously, the good couple arose and stood in mute expectation. The contest without seemed fierce and violent. It was, however, soon over. The barking ceased, for, with true canine instinct, Monty quickly discovered that a friend, not an enemy, of the family was coming to the house, and instead of rushing to repel the supposed intruder, he was now at the door, whimpering and dancing for the admission of himself and his newly made friend. Mr. Listwell knew by this movement that all was well. He advanced and opened the door, and saw by the light that streamed out into the darkness a tall man advancing slowly towards the house, with a stick in his hand and a small bundle in the others. "It's a traveler," thought he, "who's missed the way, and is coming to inquire the road. I'm glad we did not go to bed earlier. I felt all this evening as if somebody would be here tonight." The man had now halted a short distance from the door, and looked prepared alike for flight or battle. "Come in, sir. Don't be alarmed. You've probably lost your way." Slightly hesitating, the traveler walked in, not, however, without regarding his host with a scrutinizing gaze. "No, sir," said he. "I've come to ask you a greater favor." Instantly, Mr. Listwell exclaimed, as the recollection of the Virginia forest scene flashed upon him, "Oh, sir, I know not your name, but I have seen your face and heard your voice before. I'm so glad to see you. I know all. You were flying for your liberty. Be seated, be seated. Banish all fear. You are safe under my roof." This recognition, so unexpected, rather disconcerted and disquieted the noble fugitive. The timidity and suspicion of persons escaping from slavery are easily awakened, and often what is intended to dispel the one and to allay the other has precisely the opposite effect. It was so in this case. Quickly observing the unhappy impression made by his words and action, Mr. Listwell assumed a more quiet and inquiring aspect, and finally succeeded in removing the apprehensions which his very natural and generous salutation had aroused. Thus assured, the stranger said, "Sir, you have rightly guessed. I am indeed a fugitive from slavery. My name is Madison Washington, my mother used to call me. I am on my way to Canada, where I learned that persons of my color are protected in all the rights of men, and my object in calling upon you was to beg the privilege of resting my weary limbs for the night in your barn. It was my purpose to have continued my journey till morning, but the piercing cold and frowning darkness compelled me to seek shelter, and seeing a light through the lattice of your window, I was encouraged to come here to beg the privilege named. You will do me a great favor by affording me shelter for the night." "Resting place, indeed, sir, you shall have. Not, however, in my barn, but in the best room of my house. Consider yourself, if you please, under the roof of a friend, for such am I to you, and to all your deeply injured race." While this introductory conversation was going on, the kind lady had revived the fire and was diligently preparing supper, for she, not less than her husband, felt for the sorrows of the oppressed and hunted ones of earth, and was always glad of an opportunity to do them a service. A bountiful repast was quickly prepared, and the hungry and toil-worn bondman was cordially invited to partake thereof. Gratefully he acknowledged the favor of his benevolent benefactress, but appeared scarcely to understand what such hospitality could mean. It was the first time in his life that he had met so humane and friendly a greeting at the hands of persons whose color was unlike his own. Yet it was impossible for him to doubt the charitableness of his new friends, or the genuineness of the welcome so freely given, and he therefore, with many thanks, took his seat at the table with Mr. and Mrs. Listwell, who, desirous to make him feel at home, took a cup of tea themselves, while urging upon Madison the best that the house could afford. Supper over, all doubts and apprehensions banished, the three drew round the blazing fire, and a conversation commenced which lasted till long after midnight. "Now," said Madison to Mr. Listwell, "I was a little surprised and alarmed when I came in by what you said. Do tell me, sir, why you thought you had seen my face before, and by what you knew me to be a fugitive from slavery, for I'm sure that I never was before in this neighborhood, and I certainly sought to conceal what I supposed to be the manner of a fugitive slave." Mr. Listwell at once frankly disclosed the secret, described the place where he first saw him, rehearsed the language which he, Madison, had used, referring to the effect which his manner and speech had made upon him, declaring the resolution he there formed to be an abolitionist, telling how often he had spoken of the circumstance, and the deep concern he had ever since felt to know what was become of him, and whether he had carried out the purpose to make his escape, as in the woods he declared he would do. "Ever since that morning," said Mr. Listwell, "you've seldom been absent from my mind, and though now I did not dare to hope that I should ever see you again, I've often wished that such might be my fortune, for from that hour your face seems to be daguerreotyped in my memory." Madison looked quite astonished, and felt amazed at the narration to which he had listened. After recovering himself, he said, "I well remember that morning and the bitter anguish that wrung my heart. I will state the occasion of it. Oh, sorry. Sudden frog. I well remember that morning and the bitter anguish that wrung my heart. I will state the occasion of it. I had on the previous Sunday suffered a cruel lashing, had been tied up to the limb of a tree, with my feet chained together, and a heavy iron bar placed between my ankles. Thus suspended, I received on my naked back 40 stripes, and was kept in this distressing position 3 or 4 hours, and was then let down, only to have my torture increased. For my bleeding back, gashed by the cow skin, was washed by the overseer with old brine, partly to augment my suffering, and partly, as he said, to prevent inflammation. My crime was that I had stayed longer at the mill the previous day than it was thought I ought to have done, which I assured my master and the overseer was no fault of mine, but no excuses were allowed. "Hold your tongue, you impudent rascal," met my every explanation. Slave owners are so imperious, then their passions are excited, as to construe every word of the slave into insolence. I could do nothing but submit to the agonizing infliction, smarting still from the wounds as well as from the consciousness of being whipped for no cause. I took advantage of the absence of my master, who was gone to church, to spend the time in the woods and brood over my wretched lot. Oh, sir, I remember it well, and can never forget it. But this was 5 years ago. Where have you been since? I will try to tell you, said Madison. Just 4 weeks after that Sabbath morning, I gathered up the few rags of clothing I had, and started, as I supposed, for the north and for freedom. I must not stop to describe my feelings on taking this step. It seemed like taking a leap into the dark. The thought of leaving my poor wife and 2 little children caused me indescribable anguish, but consoling myself with the reflection that once free, I could possibly devise ways and means to gain their liberty also, I nerved myself up to make the attempt. I started, but ill luck attended me, for after being out a whole week, strange to say, I still found myself on my master's grounds. The 3rd night after being out, a season of clouds and rain set in, wholly preventing me from seeing the North Star, which I had entrusted as my guide, not dreaming that clouds might intervene between us. This circumstance was fatal to my project, for in losing my star I lost my way, so when I supposed I was far towards the north and had almost gained my freedom, I discovered myself at the very point from which I had started. It was a severe trial, for I arrived at home in great destitution. My feet were sore, and traveling in the dark I had dashed my foot against a stump and started a nail and lamed myself. I was wet and cold. 1 week had exhausted all my stores, and when I landed on my master's plantation, with all my work to be done over again, hungry, tired, lame, and bewildered, I almost cursed the day that I was born. In this extremity I approached the quarters. I did so stealthily, although in my desperation I hardly cared whether I was discovered or not. Peeping through the rents of the quarters, I saw my fellow slaves seated by a warm fire, merrily passing away the time as though their hearts knew no sorrow. Although I envied their seeming contentment, all wretchedness as I was, I despised the cowardly acquiescence in their own degradation, which it implied, and felt a kind of pride and glory in my own desperate lot. I dared not enter the quarters, for when there is seeming contentment with slavery, there is certain treachery to freedom. I proceeded towards the great house in the hope of catching a glimpse of my poor wife, whom I knew might be trusted with my secrets, even on the scaffold. Just as I reached the fence which divided the field from the garden, I saw a woman in the yard, who in the darkness I took to be my wife, but a nearer approach told me it was not she. I was about to speak. Had I done so, I would not have been here this night, for an alarm would have been sounded and the hunters been put on my track. Here were hungry, cold, thirst, disappointment, and chagrin, confronted only by the dim hope of liberty. I trembled to think of that dreadful hour, to face the deadly cannon's mouth in warm-blooded unterrified. Oh, goodness. Oh, hey, Drink. Sorry, I'm stumbling over some words here. To face the deadly cannon's mouth in warm blood unterrified is, I think, a small... Goodness, why is my voice having problems today? I'm sorry. I hope you had a good week, Drink. I will myself drink. I haven't seen you in a while. I hope you've been all right. Let's see, when is the next... Well, we have a ways to go before the next part. All right, I think my voice is good. And now I have to find my place. Oops. Here were hunger, cold thirst, disappointment, and chagrin, confronted only by the dim hope of liberty. I tremble to think of that dreadful hour. To face the deadly cannon's mouth in warm blood unterrified is, I think, a small achievement compared with a conflict like this with gaunt starvation. The gnawings of hunger conquers by degrees, till all that a man has he would give in exchange for a single crust of bread. Thank God I was not quite reduced to this extremity. Happily for me, before the fatal moment of utter despair, my good wife made her appearance in the yard. It was she. I knew her step. All was well now. I was, however, afraid to speak lest I should frighten her. Yet speak I did, and to my great joy my voice was known. Our meetings can be more easily imagined than described. For time, hunger, thirst, weariness, and lameness were forgotten. But it was soon necessary for her to return to the house. She, being a house servant, her absence from the kitchen, if discovered, might have excited suspicion. Our parting was like tearing the flesh from my bones. Yet it was the part of wisdom for her to go. She left me with the purpose of meeting me at midnight in the very forest where you last saw me. She knew the place well, as one of my melancholy resorts, and could easily find it, though the night was dark. I hastened away, therefore, and concealed myself to await the arrival of my good angel. As I lay there among the leaves, I was strongly tempted to return again to the house of my master and give myself up, but remembering my sole pledge on that memorable Sunday morning, I was able to linger out the two long hours between 10 and midnight. I may well call them long hours. I have endured much hardship. I have encountered many perils, but the anxiety of those 2 hours was the bitterest I ever experienced. True to her word, my wife came laden with provisions, and we sat down on the side of a log at that dark and lonesome hour of the night. I cannot say we talked. Our feelings were too great for that. Yet we came to an understanding that I should make the woods my home. For if I gave myself up, I should be whipped and sold away, and if I started for the north, I should leave a wife doubly dear to me. We mutually determined, therefore, that I should remain in the vicinity. In the dismal swamps I lived, sir, 5 long years, a cave for my home during the day. I wandered about at night with the wolf and the bear, sustained by the promise that my good Susan would meet me in the pine woods at least once a week. This promise was redeemed, I assure you, to the letter, greatly to my relief. I had partly become contented with my mode of life, and had made up my mind to spend my days there, but the wilderness that sheltered me thus long took fire, and refused longer to be my hiding-place. I will not harrow up your feelings by portraying the terrific scene of this awful conflagration. There is nothing to which I can liken it. It was horribly and indescribably grand. The whole world seemed on fire, and it appeared to me that the day of judgment had come, that the burning bowels of the earth had burst forth, and that the end of all things was at hand. Bears and wolves, scorched from their mysterious hiding places in the earth, and all the wild inhabitants of the untrodden forest, filled with a common dismay, ran forth, yelling, howling, bewildered against the smoke and flame. The very heavens seemed to rain down fire through the towering trees. It was by the merest chance that I escaped the devouring element. running before it, and stopping occasionally to take breath, I looked back to behold its frightful ravages and to drink in its savage magnificence. It was awful, thrilling, solemn, beyond compare. When aided by the fitful wind, the merciless tempest of fire swept on, sparkling, creaking, cracking, curling, roaring, outdoing in its dreadful splendor 1,000 thunderstorms at once. From tree to tree it leaped, swallowed them up in their lurid, baleful glare, and leaving them leafless, limbless, charred, and lifeless behind. The scene was overwhelming, stunning. Nothing was spared. Cattle, tame and wild, herds of swine and of deer, wild beasts of every name and kind, huge night birds, bats and owls that had retired to their homes in lofty treetops to rest perished in that fiery storm. The long-winged buzzard and croaking raven mingled their dismal cries with those of the countless myriads of small birds that rose up to the skies and were lost to the sights in clouds of smoke and flame. Oh, I shudder when I think of it. Many a poor wandering fugitive who, like myself, had sought amongst wild beasts the mercy denied by our fellow men, saw in helpless consternation his dwelling place and city of refuge reduced to ashes forever. It was this grand conflagration that drove me hither. I ran alike from fire and from slavery. After a light pause, but before speaker and hearers were deeply moved by the above recital, Mr. Listwell addressed Madison, said, "If it does not weary you too much, do tell us something of your journeying since this disastrous burning. We are deeply interested in everything you can throw light on the hardships of persons escaping from the slavery. We could hear you talk all night. Are there no incidents that you could relate of your travels hither? Or are they such that you do not like to mention them?" "For the most part, sir, my course has been uninterrupted, and considering the circumstances, at times even pleasant. I've suffered little for want of food, but I need not tell you how I got it. Your moral code may differ from mine, as your customs and usages are different. The fact is, sir, during my flight, I felt myself robbed by society of all my just rights, that I was in an the fact, sir, is, during my flight, I felt myself robbed by society of all my just rights, that I was in my enemy's land, who sought both my life and my liberty. They had transformed me into a brute, made merchandise of my body, and for all the purposes of my flight, turned day into night. And guided by my own necessities, and in contempt of their conventionalities, I did not scruple to take bread where I could get it." "And just there you were right," said Mr. Listwell. "I once had doubts on this point myself, but a conversation with Garrett Smith, a man, by the way, that I wish you could see, for he is a devoted friend of your race, and I know he would receive you gladly, put an end to all my doubts on this point. But do not let me interrupt you." "I had but one narrow escape during my whole journey," said Madison. "Do let us hear it," said Mr. Listwell. 2 weeks ago," continued Madison, "after traveling all night, I was overtaken by daybreak in what seemed to me an almost interminable wood. I deemed it unsafe to go further, and, as usual, I looked around for a suitable tree in which to spend the day. I liked one with a bushy top, and found one just to my mind. Up I climbed, and hiding myself as well as I could, I, with this strap, pulling one out of his old coat pocket, lashed myself to a bough and flattened myself that I should get a good night's sleep that day. But in this I was soon disappointed. I'd scarcely got fastened to my natural hammock when I heard the voices of a number of persons, apparently approaching the part of the woods where I was. Upon my word, sir, I dreaded more these humans' voices than I should have done those of wild beasts. I was at a loss to know what to do. If I descended, I should probably be discovered by the men, and if they had dogs, I should doubtless be treed. It was an anxious moment, but hardships and dangers have been the accomplishments of my life, and have, perhaps, imparted to me a certain hardness of character, which, to some extent, adapts me to them. In my present predicament, I decided to hold my place in the tree-top and abide the consequences. But here I must disappoint you, for the men, who were all colored, halted at least 100 yards from me, and began with their axes, in right good earnest, to attack the trees. The sound of their laughing axes was like the report of as many well-charged pistols. By and by there came down at least a dozen trees with a terrible crash. They leaped upon the fallen trees with an air of victory. I could see no dogs with them, and felt myself comparatively safe, though I could not forget the possibility that some freak or fancy might bring the axe a little nearer my dwelling than comported with my safety. There was no sleep for me that day, and I wished for night. You may imagine that the thought of having the tree attacked under me was far from agreeable, and that it very easily kept me on the lookout. The day was not without a diversion. The men at work seemed to be a gay set, and they would often make the woods resound with that uncontrolled laughter for which we as a race are remarkable. I held my place in the tree till sunset, saw the men put up their jackets to be off. I observed that all left the ground except one, whom I saw sitting on the side of a stump, with his head bowed and his eyes apparently fixed on the ground. I became interested in him. After sitting in the position to which I have alluded 10 to 15 minutes, he left the stump, walked directly towards the tree in which I was secreted, and halted almost under the same. He stood for a moment and looked around, deliberately and reverently took off his hat, by which I saw that he was a man in the evening of life, slightly bald and quite gray. After laying down his hat carefully, he knelt and prayed aloud, and such a prayer! The most fervent, earnest, and solemn to which I think I ever listened. After reverently addressing the Almighty as the all-wise, all-good, and the common Father of all mankind, he besought God for grace, for strength, to bear up under and to endure, as a good soldier, all the hardships and trials which beset the journey of life, and to enable him to live in a manner which accorded with the gospel of Christ. His soul now broke out in humble supplication for deliverance from bondage. "O thou," said he, "thou hearest the raven's cry, take pity on poor me. O deliver me in mercy. O God, deliver me from the chains and manifold hardships of slavery. With thee, O Father, all things are possible. Thou canst stand and measure the earth. Thou hast beheld and drove asunder the nations, all powerful in thy hand. Thou didst say of old, I have seen the affliction of my people, and am come to deliver them. O look down upon our afflictions, and have mercy upon us." But I cannot repeat his prayer, nor can I give you an idea of its deep pathos. I had given but little attention to religion, and had but little faith in it. Yet, as the old man prayed, I felt almost like coming down and kneeling by his side, and mingling my broken complaint with his. He had already gained my confidence, as how could it be otherwise? I knew enough of religion to know that the man who prays in secret is far more likely to be sincere than he who loves to pray standing in the street or in the great congregation. When he arose from his knees, like another Zacchaeus, I came down from the tree. He seemed a little alarmed at first, but I told him my story, and the good man embraced me in his arms and assured me of his sympathy. I was now about out of provisions, and thought I might safely ask him to help me replenish my store. He said he had no money, but if he had, he freely would have given it to me. I told him I had $1. It was all the money I had in the world. I gave it to him, and asked him to purchase some crackers and cheese, and to kindly bring me the balance, that I would remain in or near that place, and would come to him on his return if he would whistle. He was gone only about an hour. Meanwhile, from some cause or other, I know not what, but as you shall see very wisely, I changed my place. On his return, I started to meet him, but it seemed as if the shadow of approaching danger fell upon my spirit and checked my progress. In a very few minutes, closely on the heels of the old man, I distinctly saw 14 men with something like guns in their hands. "Oh, the old wretch!" exclaimed Mrs. Listwell. "He had betrayed you, had he?" "I think not," said Madison. "I cannot believe that the old man was to blame. He probably went into a store, asked for the articles for which I sent, and presented the bill I gave him. And it is so unusual for slaves in the country to have money that fact doubtless excited suspicion and gave rise to inquiry. I can easily believe that the truthfulness of the old man's character compelled him to disclose the facts, and thus there were bloodthirsty men put on my track. Of course, I did not present myself, but hugged my hiding-place securely. If discovered and attacked, I resolved to sell my life as dearly as possible." After searching about the woods silently for a time, the whole company gathered round the old man. One charged him with lying, and called him an old villain, as he was a thief. Charged him with stealing money, said if he did not instantly tell where he got it, they would take the shirt from his old back and give him 39 lashes. "I did not steal the money," said the old man. "It was given to me, as I told you, at the store, and if the man who gave it me is not here, it is not my fault." "Hush, you lying old rascal! I'll make you smart for it. You shall not leave this spot until you have told where you got that money." They now took hold of him and began to strip him, while others went to get sticks with which to beat him. I felt, as at the moment, like rushing out into the midst of them, but considering that the old man would be whipped the more for having aided a fugitive slave, and that, perhaps, in the melee, he might be killed outright, I disobeyed this impulse. They tied him to a tree and began to whip him. My own flesh crept at every blow, and I seemed to hear the old man's piteous cries even now. They laid 39 lashes on his bare back, and were going to repeat that number, when one of the company besought his comrades to desist. "You'll kill the darned old scoundrel. You've already whipped $1's worth out of him, even if he stole it." "Oh, yes," said another. "Let him down. He'll never tell us another lie, I'll warrant ye." With this, one of the company untied the old man, and bid him go about his business. The old man left, but the company remained as much as an hour, scouring the woods. Round and round they went, turning up the underbrush and peering about like so many bloodhounds. 2 or 3 times they came within 6 feet of where I lay. I tell you, I held my stick with a firmer grasp than I did in coming up to your house tonight. I expected to level one of them at least. Fortunately, however, I eluded their pursuit, and they left me alone in the woods. My last $1 was now gone, and you may well suppose I felt the loss of it. But the thought of being once again free to pursue my journey prevented that depression which a sense of destitution causes. So, ringing my little bundle on my back, I caught a glimpse of the great bear, which ever points the way to my beloved star, and I started again on my journey. But I lost in money. I made up at the hen roost that same night, upon which I fortunately came. "But you didn't eat your food raw. How can you cook it?" said Mrs. Listwell. "No, ma'am," said Madison, turning to his little bundle. "I had the means of cooking." Here he took out of his bundle an old-fashioned tinder-box, and taking up a piece of a file which he brought with him, he struck it with a heavy flint and brought out at least 12 sparks at once. "I've had this old box," said he, "more than 5 years. It was the only property saved from the fire in the dismal swamp. It has done me a good service. It has given me the means of broiling many a chicken." It seemed quite a relief to Mrs. Listwell to know that Madison had at least lived upon cooked food. Women have a perfect horror of eating uncooked food. By this time, thoughts of what was best to be done about getting Madison to Canada began to trouble Mr. Listwell, for the laws of Ohio were very stringent against anyone who should aid, or who were found aiding, a slave to escape through that state. A citizen, for the simple act of taking a fugitive slave in his carriage, had just been stripped of all of his property and thrown penniless upon the world. Notwithstanding this, Mr. Listwell was determined to see Madison safely on his way to Canada. "Give yourself no uneasiness," he said to Madison, "for if it cost my farm, I shall see you safely out of the States and on your way to a land of liberty. Thank God that there is such a land so near us. You will spend tomorrow with us, and tomorrow night I will take you in my carriage to the lake. Once upon that, and you are safe." Thank you," said the fugitive. "I will commit myself to your care." For the first time during 5 years, Madison enjoyed the luxury of resting his limbs on a comfortable bed. Oh, hey, welcome, Nightmare. I hope you're enjoying Storytime so far. I am just getting near the end of part 2, and we're maybe a third of the way through the book, so we may do this in 2 story times. I hope your weekend's been going all right. I'll stop to chat in a little bit when we've reached the chapter end. For the first time during 5 years, Madison enjoyed the luxury of resting his limbs on a comfortable bed and inside a human habitation. Looking at the white sheets, he said to Mr. Listwell, What, sir, you don't mean that I shall sleep in that bed?" Oh, yes. After Mr. Listwell left the room, Madison said he really hesitated whether or not he should lie on the floor, for that was far more comfortable and inviting than any bed to which he had been used. Actually, I'm going to take a little bit of a break here because we're just at like a little break in the chapter. And don't worry if you were worried about having missed this, the first half of this story time. I will have it on VOD, but then I'm going to, like everything else, like every other story time that I have, I'm going to put it on YouTube. And Corral, could you post up a link to my YouTube, please? And I'll post up a link to my socials. So those are my socials. And I think you're doing the YouTube. Let me go find the kitties. We're going to take a small ASMR break. Oops, sorry. There we go. So these are the 2 cats for which we are giving treats. And I will be right back with the cats for their treats. Yes, good, I do have that. The stockings are my strong rubber. Okay. We'll grab my okay. Oh, and thank you so much for joining the Discord. Kitties, don't go away. Come on. This is from Corral. And there's Snoggings. There's Snoggings. Meister eats his on the floor. Snoggings likes to eat hers on the desk. You can see little drawings of them right there on the side. That was all for now. You can stay for story time if you want, you guys. And you get a link up to my YouTube as well. Hey, nope, that's not your water. And there's my YouTube. All right, so let us continue. There it is. We pass over the thoughts and feelings, the hopes and fears, the plans and purposes that resolved in the mind of Madison during the day that he was secreted at the house of Mr. Listwell. The reader will be content to know that nothing occurred to endanger his liberty or to excite alarm. Many were the little attentions bestowed upon him in his quiet retreat and hiding place. In the evening, Mr. Listwell, after treating Madison to a new suit of winter clothes, and replenishing his exhausted purse with $5, all in silver, brought out his 2-horse wagon, well provided with buffaloes, and silently started off with him to Cleveland. They arrived there without interruptions, a few minutes before sunrise the next morning. Fortunately, the steamer or admiral lay at the wharf, and was to start for Canada at 9 o'clock. Here the last anticipated danger was surmounted. It was feared that just at this point the hunters of men might be on the lookout and possibly pounce upon their victim. Mr. Listwell saw the captain of the boat, cautiously sounded him on the matter of carrying liberty-loving passengers before he introduced his precious charge. This done, Madison was conducted on board. With usual generosity, this true subject of the emancipating Queen welcomed Madison and assured him that he should be safely landed in Canada free of charge. Madison now felt himself no more a piece of merchandise but a passenger, and, like any other passenger, going about his business, carrying with him what belonged to him, and nothing which rightfully belonged to anybody else. Wrapped in his new winter suit, snug and comfortable, a pocket full of silver, safe from his pursuers, embarked for a free country, Madison gave every sign of sincere gratitude and bade his kind benefactor farewell, with such a grip of the hand as bespoke a heart full of honest manliness and a soul that knew how to appreciate kindness. It need scarcely be said that Mr. Listwell was deeply moved by the gratitude and friendship he had excited in a nature so noble as that of the fugitive. He went to his home that day with a joy and gratification that knew no bounds. He had done something to deliver the spoiled out of the hands of the spoiler. He had given bread to the hungry and clothes to the naked. He had befriended a man to whom the laws of his country forbade all friendship, and in proportion to the odds against his righteous deed was the delightful satisfaction that gladdened his heart. On reaching home, he exclaimed, "He is safe! He is safe! He is safe!" And the cup of his joy was shared by his excellent lady. The following letter was received from Madison a few days after. Windsor, Canada West, December 16th, 1840. My dear friend, for such you truly are, Madison is out of the woods at last. I nestle in the mane of the British lion, protected by his mighty paw from the talons and the beak of the American eagle. I am free and breathe an atmosphere too pure for slaves, slave hunters, or slave holders. My heart is full. As many thanks to you, sir, and to your kind lady, as there are pebbles on the shores of Lake Erie, and may the blessing of God rest upon you both. You will never be forgotten by your profoundly grateful friend, Madison, Washington. Part 3. His head was with his heart, and that was far away. Childe Harold. Just upon the edge of the great road from Petersburg, Virginia, to Richmond, and only about 15 miles from the latter place, there stands a somewhat ancient and famous public tavern, quite notorious in its better days, and being the grand resort for most of the leading gamblers, horse racers, cockfighters, and slave traders from all the country round about. This old rookery, the nucleus of all sorts of birds, mostly those of ill omen, has, like everything else peculiar in Virginia, lost much of its ancient consequence and splendor. Yet it keeps up some appearance of gaiety and high life, and is still frequented even by respectable travelers who are unacquainted with its past history and present condition. Its fine old portico looks well at a distance, and gives the building an air of grandeur. A nearer view, however, does little to sustain this pretension. The house is large, and its styles imposing, but time and dissipation, unfailing in their results, have made ineffaceable marks upon it, and it must, in the common course of events, soon be numbered by the things that were. The gloomy mantle of ruin is already outspread to envelop it, and its remains, even but now, remind one of a human skull after the flesh has mingled with the earth. Old hats and rags fill the places in the upper windows, once occupied by large panes of glass, and the molding boards along the roofing have dropped off from their place, leaving holes and crevices in the rented wall for bats and swallows to build their nests in. The platform of the portico, which fronts the highway, is a rickety affair. Its planks are loose, and in some places entirely gone, leaving effective man-traps in their stead for nocturnal ramblers. The wood pillars which once supported it, but which now hang as encumbrances, are all rotten and tremble with the touch. A part of the stable, a fine old structure in its day, which has given comfortable shelter to hundreds of the noblest steeds of the Old Dominion at once, has blown down many years ago, and never has been, and probably never will be, rebuilt. The doors of the barn are in wretched condition. They will shut with a little human strength to help their worn-out hinges, but not otherwise. The size of the great building seen from the road is much discolored in sundry places by slops poured from the upper windows, rendering it unsightly and offensive in other respects. 3 or 4 great dogs, looking as dull and gloomy as the mansion itself, lie stretched out across the door-sills under the portico, and double the number of loafers, some of them completely rum-ripe and others ripening, dispose themselves like so many sentinels upon the front of the house. These latter understand the science of scraping acquaintance to perfection. They know everybody, and almost everybody knows them. Of course, as their little title implies, they have no regular employment. They are, to use an expressive phrase, hangers-on, or still better, they are what sailors would denominate holders-on to the slack in everybody's mess and in everybody's watch. They are, however, as good as the newspapers for the events of the day, and they sell their knowledge almost as cheap. Money they seldom have, yet they always have capital the most reliable. They make their way with a succeeding traveler by intelligence gained from the preceding one. All the great names of Virginia they know by heart, and have seen their owners often. The history of the house is folded in their lips, and they rattle off stories in connection with it, equal to the guides of Dryburgh Abbey. He must be a shrewd man, well skilled in the art of evasion, who gets out of the hands of these fellows without being at the expense of a treat. It was at this old tavern, while on a second visit to the state of Virginia in 1841, that Mr. Listwell, unacquainted with the fame of the place, turned aside about sunset to pass the night. Riding up to the house, he had scarcely dismounted when one of the half-dozen bar-room fraternity met and addressed him in a manner exceedingly bland and accommodating. "Fine evening, sir." "Very fine," said Mr. Listwell. "This is a tavern, I believe?" "Oh, yes, sir. Although you may not think it looks a little the worse for wear, it was once as good a house as any in Virginia. I make no doubt as you spend the night here, you'll make it, a good house yet, for there ain't a more accommodating man in the country than you'll find the landlord." Listwell. "The most I want is a good bed for myself and a full manger for my horse. If I get these, I shall be quite satisfied." Loafer. "Well, I always like to hear a gentleman talk for his horse. And just because the horse can't talk for itself. A man that don't care about his beast and don't look after it when he's traveling ain't much in my eye anyhow. Now, sir, I likes a horse, and I'll guarantee your horse will be taken good care of here. That old stable, for all you see it looks so shabby now, once sheltered the great Eclipse when he run here again Bachelor and Jumpin' Jemmy. Them was fast horses, but he beat 'em both." Listwell. "Indeed." Loafer. "Well, I rather reckon you've traveled a right smart distance today, from the look of your horse." Listwell. 40 miles only." Loafer. "Well, I'll be damned if that ain't a pretty good only. Mister, that beast of yours is a singed cat, I warrant you. I never seed a creature like that wasn't good on the road. You've come from about 40 miles, then?" Yes, and a pretty good pace at that." "You're somewhat in a hurry, then, I make no doubt. I reckon I could guess if I would that you're going to Richmond for. What you're going to Richmond for. I wouldn't be much of a guess either, for it's rumored hereabouts that there's to be the greatest sale of niggers at Richmond's tomorrow that has taken place here in a long time, and I'll be bound you're going there to have a hand in it." Full disclosure, since this is Frederick Douglass's writing, I wanted to keep it as strict to the letter as I possibly could, otherwise I would not use those words. Let's see. "Why, you must think, then, that there's money to be made in that business." "Well, upon my honor, sir, I never made any that way myself, but it stands to reason there that it's a money-making business, for almost all other business in Virginia has dropped to engage in this. One thing is certain, I never seen a nigger buyer yet that hasn't a plenty of money, and he wasn't as free with it as water. I was known one of 'em to treat as high as 20 times in a night, and generally speaking, there's men of education, knows all about the government. Fact is, sir, I always like to hear 'em talk, because I always can learn something from 'em. What may I call your name, sir?" "Why, now, they calls me Wilkes. I'm known all round by the gentlemen that comes here. They all knows old Wilkes." "Well, Wilkes, you seem to be acquainted here, and I see you have a strong liking for a horse. Be so good as to speak a kind word for mine to the hostler tonight, and you'll not lose anything by it." "Well, sir, I see you don't say much, but you've got an insight into things. It's always wise to get the good will of them that's acquainted about a tavern, for a man don't know when he goes into a house what may happen, or how much he may need a friend." Here the loafer gave Mr. Listwell a significant grin, which expressed a sort of triumphant pleasure at having, as he supposed, by his tact succeeded in placing a so fine-appearing a gentleman under obligations to him. The pleasure, however, was mutual, for there was something so insinuating in the glance of that loquacious customer that Mr. Listwell was very glad to get quit of him, and to do so more successfully he ordered his supper to be brought to him in his private room, private to the eye, but not to the ear. This room was directly over the bar, and the plastering being off, nothing but pine boards and naked lath separated him from the disagreeable company below. He could easily hear what was said in the bar-room, and was rather glad of the advantage it afforded, for, as you shall see, it furnished him important hints as to the manner and deportment he should assume during his stay at the tavern. Mr. Listwell says he had got into his room, but a few moments when he heard the officious Wilkes below, in a tone of disappointment, exclaim, "Where's that gentleman?" Wilkes was evidently expecting to meet with his friend at the bar-room on his return, and had no doubt of his doing the handsome thing. "He's gone to his room," answered the landlord, "and has ordered his supper to be brought to him." Here, with someone shouted out, "Who is he, Wilkes? Where's he going?" "I'll be hanged if I know. But I'm willing to make any man a bet of his old hat agin a $5 bill that gent is as full of money as a dog is of fleas. He's going down to Richmond to buy niggers, I make no doubt. He's no fool, I warrant ye." "Well, he acts darn strange," said another. "Anyhow, I likes to see a man when he comes up to a tavern to come straight into the bar-room and show that he's a man among them. Nobody was going to bite him. I don't blame him a bit for not coming in here. That man knows his business and means to take care on his money," answered Wilkes. "Wilkes, you're a fool. You only say that because you hope to get a few coppers out on him. You only measure my corn by your half bushel. I won't say that you're only mad because I got the chance of speaking to him first. Oh, Wilkes, you're known here. Praise up to anybody that will give you a copper. Besides, 'tis my opinion that fellow took his long slab sides upstairs for all the world just like a half-scared woman, afraid to look honest men in the face. He's a northerner, and as mean as dishwater." "Now, what will you bet on that?" said Wilkes. "Oh, yes, I saw that. I will definitely have to raid her when the stream is done." "Now, what will you bet on that?" said Wilkes. The speaker said, "I make no bets with you, in case you can get that fellow upstairs there to say anything." "Well," said Wilkes, "I'm willing to bet any man in the company that gentleman is a nigger buyer. He didn't tell me so right down, but I reckon I knows enough about men to give a pretty clean guess as to what they are after." The dispute was to who Mr. Listwell was, what his business, where he was going, etc., was kept up with such animation for some time, and more than once threatened a serious disturbance of the place. Wilkes had his friends as well as his opponents. After his sharp debate, the company amused themselves by drinking whiskey and telling stories, the latter consisting of quarrels, fights, rencontres, and duels, in which distinguished. Why was that word hard for me? In which distinguished persons of that neighborhood and frequenters of that house had been actors. Some of these stories were frightful enough, and were told, too, with a relish which bespoke the pleasure of the parties with the horrid scenes they portrayed. It would not be proper here to give the reader any idea of the vulgarity and dark profanity which rolled as a sweet morsel under these corrupt tongues. A more brutal set of characters perhaps never congregated. Disgusted and a little alarmed withal, Mr. Listwell, who was not accustomed to such entertainment, at length retired, but not to sleep. He was too much wrought upon by what he had heard to rest quietly, and what snatches of sleep he got were interrupted by dreams which were anything than pleasant. At 11 o'clock there seemed to be several hundreds of persons crowding into the house. A loud and confused clamor, cursing and cracking of whips, and the noise of chains startled him from his bed. For a moment he would have given the half of his farm in Ohio to have been at home. This uproar was kept up with undulating course till near morning. There was loud laughing, loud singing, loud cursing, and yet there seemed to be weeping and mourning in the midst of all. Mr. Listwell said he had heard enough during the forepart of the night to convince him that a buyer of men and women stood the best chance of being respected. But he, therefore, thought it best to say nothing which might undo the favorable opinion that he had been formed of him in the bar-room by at least one of the fraternity that swarmed about it. While he would not avow himself a purchaser of slaves, he deemed it not prudent to disavow it. He felt that he might properly refuse to cast such a pearl before parties which to him were worse than swine, to reveal himself and to impart a knowledge of his real character and sentiments would, to say the least, be imparting intelligence with the certainty of seeing it and himself both abused. Mr. Listwell confesses that this reasoning did not altogether satisfy his conscience, for, hating slavery as he did, and regarding it to be the immediate duty of every man to cry out against it, without compromise and without concealment, it was hard for him to admit to himself the possibility of circumstances wherein a man might properly hold his tongue on the subject. Having as little of the spirit of a martyr as Erasmus, he concluded, like the latter, that it was wiser to trust the mercy of God for his soul than the humanity of slave traders for his body. Bodily fear, not conscientious scruples, prevailed. In this spirit he rose early in the morning, manifesting no surprise at what he had heard during the night. His quondam friend was soon at his elbow, boring him with all sorts of questions, all, however, directed to find out his character, business, residence, purposes, and destination. With the most perfect appearance of good nature and carelessness, Mr. Listwell evaded these meddlesome inquiries and turned conversation to general topics, leaving himself and all that specially pertained to him out of discussion. Disengaging himself from their troublesome companionship, he made his way towards any bowling alley which was connected with the house, and which, like all the rest, was in very bad repair. On reaching the alley, Mr. Listwell saw for the first time in his life a slave gang on their way to market. A sad sight, truly. Here were 130 human beings, children of a common Creator, guilty of no crime, men and women with hearts, minds, and deathless spirits, chained and fettered and bound for the market in a Christian country, in a country boasting of its liberty, independence, and high civilization. Humanity converted into merchandise and linked in iron bands with no regard of decency or humanity. All sizes, ages, and sexes, mothers, fathers, daughters, brothers, sisters, all huddled together on their way to market to be sold and separated from home and from each other forever. And all to fill the pockets of men too lazy to work for an honest living, and who gain their fortune by plundering the helpless and trafficking in the souls and sinews of other men. As he gazed upon this revolting and heart-rending scene, our informant said he almost doubted the existence of a God of justice, and he stood wondering what the earth did not open, that the earth did not open and swallow up such wickedness. In the midst of these reflections, and while running his eye up and down the fettered ranks, he met the glance of one whose face he thought he had seen before. To be resolved, he moved towards the spot. It was Madison Washington. Here was a scene for the pencil. Had Mr. Listwell been confronted by one risen from the dead, he could not have been more appalled. He was completely stunned. A thunderbolt could not have struck him more dumb. He stood for a few moments as motionless as one petrified. Collecting himself, he at length exclaimed, "Madison, is that you?" The noble fugitive, a little less astonished than himself, answered cheerily, "Oh, yes, sir, they've got me again." Thoughtless of consequences for that moment, Mr. Listwell ran up to his old friend, placing his hands upon his shoulders, and looked him dead in the face. Speechless, they stood gazing at each other as if to be doubly resolved that there was no mistake about the matter, till Madison motioned his friend away, intimating a fear lest the keepers should find him there and suspect him of tampering with the slaves. "They will soon be out to look after us. You can come when they go to breakfast, and I will tell you all." Pleased with this arrangement, Mr. Listwell passed out of the alley, but only just in time to save himself, for while near the door, he observed 3 men making their way to the alley. The thought occurred to him to wait their arrival as the best means of diverting the ever-ready suspicions of the guilty. While the scene between Mr. Listwell and his friend Madison was going on, the other slaves stood as mute spectators, at a loss to know what all this could mean. As he left, he heard the man chained to Madison ask, "Who is that gentleman?" "He's a friend of mine. I cannot tell you now. Suffice it to say he is a friend. You shall hear more of him before long. But mark me, whatever shall pass between that gentleman and me, in your hearing, I pray you will say nothing about it. We are all chained here together. Ours is a common lot, and that gentleman is no less your friend than mine." At these words, all mysterious as they were, the unhappy company gave signs of satisfaction and hope. It seemed that Madison, by that mesmeric power, which is the invariable accompaniment of genius, had already won the confidence of the gang, and was a sort of general-in-chief among them. By this the keepers arrived, the horrid trio well fitted for their demoniacal work. Their uncombed hair came down over foreheads villainously low, and with eyes, mouths, and nose to match. "Hello, hello," they growled as they entered. "Are you all here?" "All here," said Madison. "Well, well, that's right. Your journey will soon be over. You'll be in Richmond by 11 today, and then you'll have an easy time on it." "I say, gal, what in the devil are you crying about?" said one of them. "I'll give you something to cry about if you don't mind." This was said to a girl, apparently not more than 12 years old, who had been weeping bitterly. She had probably left behind her a loving mother, affectionate sisters, brothers, and friends, and her tears were but the natural expression of her sorrow, and the only solace. But the dealers in human flesh have no respect for such sorrow. They look upon it as a protest against their cruel injustice, and they are prompt to punish it. This is a puzzle not easily solved. How came he here? What can I do for him? May I not even now be in some way compromised in this affair? Were thoughts that troubled Mr. Listwell, and made him eager for the promised opportunity to speak to Madison. The bell now sounded for breakfast, and keepers and drivers, with pistols and bowie knives gleaming from their belts, hurried in, as if to get the best places. Taking the chance now afforded, Mr. Listwell hastened back to the bowling alley. Reaching Madison, he said, "Now do tell me all about the matter. Do you know me?" "Oh, yes," said Madison. "I know you well, and shall never forget you nor that cold and dreary night you gave me shelter. I must be short," he continued, "for they'll soon be out again. This, then, is the story in brief. On reaching Canada and getting over the excitement of making my escape, sir, my thoughts turned to my poor wife, who had well deserved my love by her virtuous fidelity, and undying affection for me. I could not bear the thought of leaving her in the cruel jaws of slavery without making an effort to rescue her. First I tried to get money to buy her, but the process was too slow. I despaired of accomplishing it. She was in all my thoughts by day and my dreams by night. Times I could almost hear her voice saying, 'Oh, Madison, Madison, will you then leave me here? Can you leave me here to die? No, no, they will come, you will come.' I was wretched. I had lost my appetite. I could neither work, eat, nor sleep, till I resolved to hazard my own liberty to gain that of my wife. But I must be short. 6 weeks ago I reached my old master's place. I laid about the neighborhood nearly a week watching my chance, and finally I ventured upon the desperate attempt to reach my poor wife's room by means of a ladder. I reached the window, but the noise in raising it frightened my wife, and she screamed and fainted. I took her in my arms and was descending the ladder when the dogs began to bark furiously, and before I could get to the woods, the white folk were roused. The cool night air soon restored my wife, and she readily recognized me. We made the best of our way to the woods, but it was now too late. The dogs were after us as though they would have torn us to pieces. It was all over with me now. My old master and his 2 sons ran out with loaded rifles, and before we were out of gunshot, our ears were assailed with "Stop! Stop, or be shot down!" Nevertheless, we ran on. Seeing that we gave no heed to their calls, they fired, and my poor wife fell by my side dead. While I received but a slight flesh wound, I now became desperate and stood my ground and waited their attack over her dead body. They rushed upon me with their rifles in hand. I parried their blows and fought them till I was knocked down and overpowered. "Oh, that was madness to have returned," said Mr. Listwell. Sure, I could not be free with the galling thought that my poor wife was still a slave. With her in slavery, my body, not my spirit, was free. I was taken to the house, chained to a ring bolt, my wounds dressed. I was kept there 3 days. All the slaves from miles round were brought to see me. Many slaveholders came with their slaves, using me as proof of slaves getting away. I was taunted, jeered at, and berated by them in a manner that pierced me to the soul. Thank God I was able to smother my rage and to bear all with seeming composure. After my wounds were nearly healed, I was taken to a tree and stripped, and I received 60 lashes on my naked back. A few days later, I was sold to a slave trader and placed in his gang for the New Orleans market. Do you think your master would sell you to me? No, sir. I was sold on condition of my being taken south. Their motive is revenge. Then, said Mr. Listwell, I fear I can do nothing for you. Put your trust in God and bear your sad lot with the manly fortitude which becomes a man. I shall see you at Richmond, but don't recognize me. Saying this, Mr. Listwell handed Madison $10, said a few words to the other slaves, received their hearty "God bless you," and made his way to the house. Fearful of exciting suspicion by too long delay, our friend went to the breakfast table, with the air of one who half reproved the greediness of those who rushed in at the sound of the bell. A cup of coffee was all that he could manage. His feelings were too bitter and excited, and his heart was too full with the fate of poor Madison, whom he loved as well as admired, to relish his breakfast. And although he sat long after the company had left the table, he really did little more than change the position of his knife and fork. The strangeness of meeting again one whom he had met on 2 several occasions before, under extraordinary circumstances, was well calculated to suspect the idea that a supernatural power, a wakeful providence, or an inexorable fate, had linked their destiny together, and that no efforts of this could disentangle him from the mysterious web of circumstances which enfolded him. On leaving the table, Mr. Listwell nerved himself up and walked firmly into the bar-room. He was at once greeted again by that talkative chatterbox, Mr. Wilkes. "Them's a likely set of niggers in the alley there," said Wilkes. "Yes, they're fine-looking fellows. One of them I should like to purchase, and for him I would be willing to give a handsome sum." Sorry, I have something in my eye. Ow. We'll get there. Sorry about the delay. I feel I should have a technical difficulty screen or something like that. Maybe a cat on a keyboard or something. Okay, hopefully that'll do. Turning to one of his comrades, and with a grin of victory, Wilkes said, "Aha, Bill, did you hear that? I told you I'd know that gentleman wanted to buy niggers and would bid as high as any purchaser in the market. Hey, Nightmare." Yeah, sorry again about the usage of the word. I normally do not use the word, but in respect for Frederick Douglass, who is the author of this, I wanted to keep it as pure to the words that he has written as possible. So, yes. Where are we? Ah, there I am. Come, said Listwell. Don't be too loud in your praise. You are old enough to know that prices rise when purchasers are plenty. Oh, that's a fact, said Wilkes. I see you knows the ropes, and there's not a man in old Virginia whom I'd rather help to make a good bargain to than you, sir. I like the little hard thing. Mr. Listwell here threw $1 at Wilkes, which the latter caught with a dexterous hand, saying, "Take that for your kind goodwill." Wilkes held up the $1 to his right eye with a grin of victory and turned to the morose grumbler in the corner who had questioned the liberality of a man of whom he knew nothing. Mr. Listwell now stood as well with the company as any other occupant of the bar-room. We pass over the hurry and bustle, the brutal vociferations of the slave drivers in getting their unhappy gang in motion for Richmond, and we need not narrate every application of the lash to those who faltered in the journey. Mr. Listwell followed the train at a long distance with a sad heart, and on reaching Richmond left his horse in a hotel and made his way to the wharf in the direction of which he saw the slave coffle driven. He was just in time to see the whole company embark for the New Orleans. The thought struck him that, while mixing with the multitude, he might do his friend Madison one last service, and he stepped into a hardware store and purchased 3 strong files. These he took with him, and standing near the small boat, which lay in waiting to bear the company by parcels to the side of the brig that lay in the stream, he managed, as Madison passed him, to slip the files into his pocket, and at once darted back among the crowd. All the company now on board, the imperious voice of the captain sounded, and instantly a dozen hardy seamen were in the rigging, hurrying aloft to unfurl the broad canvas of our Baltimore-built American slaver. The sailors hung about the ropes, like so many black cats, now in the round tops, now in the cross trees, and now on the yard arms. All were bluster and activity. Soon the broad fore topsail, the royal and top-gallant sail, was spread to the breeze. Round went the heavy windlass, clank, clank went the fall-bit. The anchors weighed, jibs, mainsails, and topsails hauled to the wind, and the long, low, black slaver, with her cargo of human flesh, careened and moved forward to the sea. Mr. Listwell stood on the shore and watched the slaver till the last speck of her upper sails faded from sight and announced the limit of a human vision. "Farewell, farewell, brave and true man. God grant that brighter skies may smile upon your future than have yet looked down upon your thorny pathway." Saying this to himself, our friend lost no time in completing his business, and in making his way homewards, gladly shaking off from his feet the dust of old Virginia. And that actually brings us to the end of this story time. We don't have that much left of the story. I'd say probably about another hour or so. but I figure we can finish that up on Thursday, which will be right in the middle of Douglas Week, which that was quite a happy coincidence when I was looking up hashtags for, I was tweeting about this. Oh, I forgot to tell my friends on Facebook about this. Drat. But yeah, anyways, thank you so much for hanging out with me, and we are going to be rating Peach Please, because it is their 1-year streamiversary, which I just had mine about a month ago, so, Oh, thank you so much. Well, I can only say thank you so much for, the reading of it. But yeah, I was so glad when I saw that this existed. I had no clue that he wrote fiction. This is the only fiction that he's written. All right. So I'm really quickly going to get a raid message ready. All right, and normally I would, yeah, it is. It's apparently based on a true story, which I will, I'll do a little more research on it, and then on Thursday, after we finish the book on Thursday, I will share what I have learned about the true story that this was based upon. Yeah. But the next story time is actually going to be on Tuesday. In that one, we're going to be continuing with the Merry Adventures of Robin Hood, the Howard Pyle translation, or not translation, version, since it was a word of mouth sort of epic series of tales. I think his was the first one, or at least the first one that we recognize, published of the Robin Hood stories. So that's what we're going to be doing on Tuesday. And of course, same time as today, 2 to 4 Pacific time. Oh, that's right. I need to get this ready. Oops. There we go. Just double checking the spellings. All right. Thank you so much again for hanging out with me, for joining me. And I hope to see you next time. Thanks so much for the follow Nightmare. And have a good day. Bye.